Hey, John, how are you?
I'm good. How about yourself?
Doing well. Thank you for joining me on Indispensable Appraisers.
I'm happy to do so.
Awesome. Let's start
Look
off.
forward to it.
Yeah, I know this is going to be good. In our valuation space, what are appraisers in general? What are we winning at?
We're still here, and I think that's important that we're still out there fighting and struggling and trying to figure out how to get through it. But our challenges are definitely significant, both from inside and from outside. And I think that it's becoming, more and more difficult, more and more burdensome. But I think that individual appraisers, by focusing their practice and focusing what they do on providing great service and defining what that service is, can be successful. And I think that elevates the whole profession.
I want to ask you, and this sounds like an obvious question, but what does great service mean to you?
Well, to me, I think that if you go back to the kind of your original question and you refer to the appraisal industry, and that's kind of a pet peeve of mine, is referring to this as are we an industry or are we a profession? And I think there's a difference in perception both inside and outside from how that works in. So if we're an industry, we make a product, and we make it the product that we make. It might be a great product, like an iPhone is a great product, but it's also a commodity. So if you're looking at buying an iPhone and somebody's willing to sell it to you for $100 cheaper than somebody else, then you're going to buy it from the lower priced retailer. And I think that's worked its way into the appraisal profession, in that what is perceived as value is not necessarily a great opinion or a helpful, wonderful dive into the property that's being appraised, but rather who's fastest and who's cheapest. And that's where the commodity issue comes in, and whether or not we are a professional service or whether we are a product. And I think that we've also, as appraisers, we've fallen into that trap in many cases, not just because we go along with the fastest, cheapest routine, but because in order to compete with that, we provide a commoditized appraisal report, something that is very generic, and in many cases presents a view from 30,000 feet rather than taking a deep dive into the property itself. So I think that, what I define as service is providing the client in a timely and reasonably priced manner something that actually assists them in making their decision, whether that decision be lending or trust, setting up a trust or some sort of a litigation issue.
And that kind of leads me into the second question is, what are the greatest challenges of the valuation space? You kind of touched upon it, but what are some other issues that we have that we're facing?
Well, I think as I referred to, I think they're both inside and outside. So, the outside ones are pretty obvious, whether it's the challenge from AI, the bias issue, the diversity issue, all of these things that are, and also the idea of young people not coming into the field. When you look at all those issues, those are all external sources, and those are big challenges. On the inside, I think we're dealing with a lot of challenges, some of which we just don't recognize, and others that we tend to ignore. One challenge is that we are, especially on the CRE side, which is where I'm at, we're dealing with an enormously complex market. It's made substantially more complex than it was early in my career. And now we're still dealing with it using tools that were developed in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Um, we look backwards, and the clients need to look forward. When you take all these various things that we do institutionally as part of our practice, we've not moved forward into the 21st century as appraisers. We're still using old tools, and I don't think that we can really move forward until we accept that and move on. The other thing is, as I mentioned, the commoditization of appraisals. What I see a lot of, because I do a fair amount of review work, what I see a lot of is, and I referred to it as the view from 30,000 feet, appraisals that have a lot of national published data, comparable sales and rental information that's from published sources, but little in terms of insight or additional research. We're dealing with an extremely opaque market in real estate. One of the most opaque markets that exists. We have non-disclosure states, we have non-disclosure agreements, and unless you're actually talking to the people that are involved in the transactions, you're doing nothing more than regurgitating data that the AI bot will be able to go with faster and cheaper once the AI bot figures out how to get a subscription to CoStar.
That's interesting. You mentioned complex market. It's funny. I was having a discussion with some investors, and they, they have this thing which I call time machine cap rates, to where you have the buyer's pro forma, seller's pro forma, appraiser's pro forma, but these investors are viewing it as like the long-term view that I'm going to ignore the cap rate for 2 to 3 years when I think the market's going to restabilize, and kind of ignore it. So, and again, I don't know if that's just a local thing, but it does show that investors are looking at data differently. They have more data. They're looking at it. Maybe that doesn't fit with our tools that we've been using forever. So I hear what you're saying about that.
Well, in a lot of ways, the people that make the decisions, we're looking at everything on a cash basis. The cap rate is for the whole property, whereas for the investor, the cap rate is only the starting point, because the net operating income gets reduced down by leverage and other factors. And that's what they're looking at. They're not looking at what the net operating income is. That doesn't drive their decisions. And what you said as far as the over time, that's a perfect example of what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years, is people were getting paid very well to wait. And so they became very aggressive in what they were willing to pay. And now that's changed.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned AI, and not we don't have to take a deep dive on it, but do you see AI as a tool that should be, my take on it, at least it should be investigated, whether or not you can find practicality in your appraisal firm, uh, or as a chief appraiser. How do you view AI? Is it just another tool that we could use to get better? Is it to modernize, or how do you view AI relative to what we do?
I think AI is going to be such a big thing that it's going to affect everything that everybody does. And so where we might be able to use it in some ways to do analysis, we might be able to use it in some ways to do research. There's a whole industry out there that's going to be using it as to replace us. And so we have to understand that it's a two-edged sword, and whether or not we are able to utilize it, that's yet to be seen. And one example that I kind of give is that the best thing that we see AI doing today is assisting in search. So if you're looking at, you're using the Copilot or something like that, what you have to understand is that the only thing that Copilot can do is look through the internet. Copilot can't call the broker. Copilot can't sit down and say, well, the reason why the cap rate appears to be a little low on this particular sale is because there's something that provides for greater upside in the future. That's where we have to come in as individuals, knowing the tools to use, but also being able to interpret that. So in the long run, I think that what appraisers are going to be doing is interpreting the data that's generated by AI for both its reliability and its applicability.
That, Thank you for that. And that leads me to the next question about, so where do we go from here? relative to the industry in general? You mentioned some external forces like AI bias, and we haven't talked about, the usual suspects of not bringing in the younger talent, attracting, the next generation. But as we look forward, what do you think what should we focus on? Maybe the top one or two things going forward. What should we focus on to improve our industry?
I think that the main thing we need to focus on is providing services that can't be provided by the alternatives. And that means we have to elevate what we're doing. If we are simply regurgitating the publicly available market data and not really analyzing it and providing context to it, then it becomes, we just don't have an excuse for existence at that point. I think that we have to develop a means of expanding our practice and making it deeper. We can't attract new people in if we're not going to be able to compensate them. And if we are looking at this continuing battle with who's going to do the appraisal faster and cheaper than somebody else, and not looking at the expertise that the individual appraiser supplies in that transaction, then it's going to be very difficult to draw people. Heck, you can go to Wall Street, become an analyst, and make a lot more money than you can as a young appraiser.
And maybe that's along the lines you mentioned earlier about how we're perceived as a service. So if we're currently perceived, and again we're generalizing, but if it's price and time kind of a commodity, how would you perceive the service? Would it be specialization? Would it be excellent customer service that you touched upon? Would it be what would it be?
Well, I think that the specialization to me has been the key. It's been my career move since the very beginning. This is my second area of specialty. I started doing mobile home park appraisals back in the 1990s when nobody else wanted to do them. And so I became kind of the go-to guy. When Fannie and Freddie decided that they wanted to enter the market, there were only 2 or 3 appraisers nationally that were being used, and I was one of them. When you look at the area, but what I've had to do is evolve my practice over time, because as the product type itself has become a more popular investment, then I'm facing competition. Much of that competition does look at the practice of the appraisals from 30,000 feet, and they don't provide the deep dive into the data that I do. So what I've had to do, I've done it very successfully, is expand my client base into the trust area, into estate tax, into litigation, into fractional interest valuations, rent control, and those areas. It's very easy to walk into a court and be given credibility as an expert witness when the first thing out of your mouth is, yes, I have done over 8,000 mobile home park appraisals. And so that kind of, if you're a specialist, you get to pick and choose a little bit more. I don't have to go with the people that are looking only for the lowest bidder. I have other areas that I practice in. So I think specialization is something that I highly recommend, maybe not with a property type, but with a concept, whether it's litigation support or doing divorce appraisals or doing condemnation. These are all areas that you can focus on and actually become a more valued resource to your client base.
Great. And you mentioned the word elevate, and that's one of the reasons the reason why I'm doing this podcast, and it's called Indispensable Appraisers, because I do think they provide a stability to the market. The CRE market is I don't know, in the US, 17 trillion, maybe it's 14 trillion now, I don't know. So it really is important. It's big. It's impactful. It affects a lot of people. So, I appreciate you joining me today because you're taking the time to elevate the industry. You're giving your opinion, and I really appreciate your time today.
Happy to do so. Happy to participate. Good luck in the future. And let's hope we're still around in another 20 years. I probably won't be, but let's hope we are.
Thank you, John.
Have a great day.